in biological psych, there's a concept called behaviorism. Now, with behaviorism, it's sort of the behavior and what you can see other people do and like the behavior they exhibit, and it's only focused towards that. There's no focus at all on like the mental state and like what you're thinking. It's all physical things that your eye can see. Within behaviorism, though, there's something called operant conditioning. It's sort of rewards and punishment program kind system that people do to mold certain beings, whether it be like pets, for example, or just children. They use this system, the operant conditioning, to sort of mold them to have certain qualities of behaviors that like you'd want to see more and want to see less. And this comes with the rewards and punishment. You would use this in order to get the results you'd want to see. And this has started to been used in like the early like 1900s and is still used to this day. Now it's more distinguished. So in operant conditioning, there were two really important key figures. One was Edward Thorndike. He sort of came before operant conditioning was more distinguished, but he sort of came up with the rubric of it. So he was able to revolutionize the law of effect, which essentially meant that that responses based off like how you felt. So for example, if you felt good after doing something, you were more likely to do it, and vice versa. If you were you're less likely to do an action if you did not feel good. If you felt like uneasiness or sort of pain, then you are less likely to do this action. And Edward Thorndike, he was an American psychologist, and he focused on animal psychology. And his experiments was testing with cats, and they put cats in a puzzle box. And what would happen is they would put food they would put food outside the box, and since it was like a maze inside the box, the cats would have to figure it out. And this would sort of help put the idea of trial and error with these animals, and it would sort of start setting up the reward system where the food outside the box would be considered the reward. Now, more on the operant conditioning side, we have B.F. Skinner. He was also an American psychologist, but he focused more on behaviorism. And this is where all the reward and punishment system starts coming to play, because he experimented with the pigeons and mice, and they would put them in the Skinner box, and in that box there were pretty much electrical currents or wires on the side, and there was a lever. So if they pushed the lever or pulled it, then they would get food, and that would be the reward. But if they didn't do that, they went out, like if they try to go outside the box, for example, they would receive like an electrical shock. And this sort of paved the way for rewards and punishment, where the food, if they did a certain action, which was pulling a lever, would get them a reward. They were more likely to do it, and by touching like the box itself, you receive an electrical shock, and they wouldn't feel good about that. So they were much less likely to do it. And that sort of paved the way for operant conditioning, where you'd more likely and less likely do an action based off like how you felt. So operant conditioning in the behaviorism sort of came as a response to normal methods of psychology. And what I mean by this is when you think of psychology, you'll first think of like the mind and like how you're feeling. But the problem is you can't really see that. And operant conditioning and behaviorism is based off what you can see, so they shifted their focus towards like what their eye can see and like what people do, and that's how behaviorism sort of came about. And for operant conditioning, it was as I said before, Edward Thorndike, his experiments sort of built the rubric of operant conditioning, where you'd start to see that animals respond differently based off like certain rewards and punishment, and that certain behaviors get exhibited more or less based off what you can get from that. And then later on, around the 1930s and 50s, Skinner came around, and his experiments sort of concluded what Thorndike Thorndike's law of effect kind of says. It kind of concluded that and said, yes, this is true, that animals will do this based off the rewards and punishment they get, and they'll exhibit certain behavior more and more, and you can mold it based off like putting like a certain task to do, they can mold them to do that behavior. So, in operant conditioning, there's a focus on the rewards and punishment system, and what this means is that I said it before at the very start, but you'll essentially be molding certain good and bad behavior based off four versions of reinforcement and punishment. So the first thing, there is positive reinforcement, then there's negative reinforcement, then there's positive punishment, and negative punishment. So what this means is, if you notice how there's two words in each of them, the positive and negative means you're adding a feeling or a stimulus, and the reinforcement or punishment means you're trying to remove or boost a certain type of behavior. So an example of this is positive reinforcement. For example, if your child gets a really good grade on a test, you might take them out for candy. You're sort of giving them an incentive to do that behavior again. And that's the positive reinforcement. For a negative reinforcement, you'd have to remove a feeling. So that means the person should already have a certain feeling already. So for example, this would be if someone is in a lot of pain and they take a painkiller, they're removing that pain. That's where the negative comes in. And then since you want to reinforce them, or you want to boost that behavior of taking more painkillers, that's where the negative reinforcement comes. So that's essentially essentially taking a painkiller, removing a certain feeling, and then taking more and more of that, because that's the reinforcement part. Along with that, there's also positive and negative punishment. So an example of this, if someone, I'll take it from the first example, if a child gets a really bad grade, they get an F on a test, you're gonna yell at them. You're sort of adding that verbal stimulus, that feeling of not feeling good after getting a bad grade on a test. And by doing that, since you're adding a component to what they have to feel, you're gonna make them most likely not gonna get that behavior again. Most likely they're gonna change it up. They're gonna start studying, and that's the negative. No, that's the positive. Sorry, that's the positive punishment. You're adding a stimulus to make sure they're less likely to repeat that behavior. And along with this, there's negative punishment. So now you have to remove something to get them to stop having a behavior. So the easiest way to say this would be if it's a child and they're just not behaving good, and you just take something away from them. Like, it can be anything. It can be like a toy, a pacifier. If you just want them to stop doing that, you take away that belonging of theirs, and all of a sudden they think, I don't want to do this anymore because I don't want this punishment to repeat it. So they're less likely to do that behavior. And those are the four kinds of positive, negative, reinforcement, and punishment. So some final thoughts on operant conditioning. If you notice a pattern, it's used mainly on children and pets, but this doesn't mean it's applied specifically and only for them. You can actually see this for adults and people our age as well. So you might see it in like the workplace, where people might give a certain like program or certain reward, like bonus, if you like do an action, if you just stay overtime, for example. And that's sort of like positive reinforcement. The same applies for just deals in general. So if you see on like the newspaper, you see deals for like food, you're like, oh, they sort of incentivize you to go to that store to buy something by giving a reward for that. And you'll see it everywhere, even like banks, for example. So what this means is, operant conditioning isn't like just for like pets or children. It applies for everybody, and you'll see this not only here in like US, you'll see this globally. So a personal example is, I've been to India a couple times, and I've been to school there. I've seen there that the teachers, they're not afraid to hit the children if they're doing something bad. And I've heard stories as well from like my parents when they were taught in school back then. So sometimes the punishment aspect will raise like some concerns, at least here in the US and maybe some other countries like maybe Canada. But this system, operant conditioning, it works globally. So like not only just here, it works all around the world. So in conclusion, operant conditioning, it was revolutionized by B.F. Skinner and Edward Thorndike, and it started early on 1900s, but now it's like a global feature. Everybody around the world uses it, and it's not just exclusive here now. It goes from everywhere. And that's it. Thank you for listening. Oh, and one final note. Although operant conditioning definitely works worldwide, everyone uses it. It's not end all be all. It's not perfect. It's sort of because it focuses mainly on the external and like certain things you see. But of course, there's still the psychology, mentally, and feeling wise, how you feel about certain things. So it's not perfect, but it's definitely useful. Thank you.